The recent social media trial verdict isn't nearly enough, but it is a start. I'm Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic, and let's dive in. Now, if you don't know what's going on here, in LA, a jury found Meta and Google liable after concluding that Instagram and YouTube were negligently designed and that the companies failed to warn about risks to minors. Now, the jury awarded a total of $6 million. Meta was assigned 70% of the fault. Google was assigned 30%. And to be very clear here, what happened is important, but we should be careful not to confuse important with transformational. And I think that is important, at least not transformational overnight. And the reason why this matters is not mainly the dollar amount. That dollar amount is insanely low. That is absolutely ridiculous in terms of the damages and liability-wise monetarily. It's like $2 for us, basically, is essentially what the jury awarded with a $6 million fine. This is a slap on the wrist. We will discuss why that is a slap on the wrist more in depth in a bit. But first, I want to talk about the significance of this, because the real significance here is that plaintiffs basically got a jury to focus on the product design of these platforms rather than just the harmful content that is being put out by third parties. And for the record, this is how these platforms like Meta, Facebook, Instagram, etc., have partially sidestepped the traditional Section 230 defense that has protected these platforms for years. And that's why people are basically calling this why people are calling this a verdict that could change social media forever. Kind of. So, let's talk about this, because if the courts increasingly treat social media features like infinite scroll, for example, autoplay, algorithmic reinforcement, in other words, you keep getting the same content over and over and over because the algorithm knows you like that, engagement loops that we all find ourselves doom scrolling through with that infinite scroll, and weak youth warnings, as if they're all seeing this as design defects or just straight up negligent choices, then social media companies are no longer only fighting content moderation disputes. That has always been their big thing with Section 230, is that we are not publishers. We're just a platform where people can put out whatever they want. We have no editorial basis for this, which technically isn't true, but here we are. They're also fighting as a result of this, product liability style claims about their actual architecture as it relates to their business model as well. And remember, they take our data, they sell our data basically to advertisers, and here we are. That is the business model. So honestly, I think this shifts the battlefield in our favor. And by our, I mean those people that want to see this whole thing shut down. And so that is you and I would hope. And essentially, I want these monsters to be properly controlled, or as I mentioned in my case, just completely shuttered. I think Facebook has been an absolute ruin on society. And for years, the Facebooks of the world have argued essentially that, we're not the speaker. Users post the content, it's not our issue. And so now we have a validated counter argument that held up in court. Basically, the harm is not just the content. The harm is the money-making machine that you, Mark Zuckerberg, etc., built to maximize compulsion, exposure, repeated use by children, and on and on and on. This distinction is frankly enormous. And it's enormous because it opens a door for such things like further discovery, expert testimony, and more. This is great. I applaud it for that. I really do. Jury scrutiny around the mechanics of these platforms then actually shifts from the content that essentially the users are creating to things like the recommendation system out there for more content, the default controls that are provided to users. It also impacts notifications frequency and cause, the watch next logic that these algorithms have, the actual likes that you can give a post, especially on Facebook, and other features that are optimized to increase time on the platform. Remember, Facebook wants you on it 24/7, 365. They never want you to leave. YouTube has a very similar feel to that, in the sense that, like, if I'm watching, car videos, they're going to keep giving me more car videos. If I'm watching videos on politics, I'll get more politics videos, and on and on and on. They want you there. They want you seeing their advertisement because people pay, or rather companies pay for that privilege. All of this is a complete positive, and it is a step in the right direction. And as I'm thinking this through, I actually think this verdict will likely change social media platforms. And I as I was putting this together, I've had time. I was sitting in an airport for like 12 hours. Thank you very much. Government shutdowns and stuff. I came up with 6 things overarchingly that I think this verdict will help impact and change. First one, it's going to increase the legal pressure to redesign features that look addictive by construction, which is an actual term as I went researching, and that isn't true, especially for minors that are using it. Remember, under COPPA, the Child Online Privacy Protection Act, anybody as young as 13 years old can sign up for what is essentially an incredibly addictive platform, and that obviously is a huge problem. Now, the second thing I thought of is that it strengthens the case for more age gating, harder age gating as well. And I think that means that we're going to see more aggressive age assurance, if not purely just to avoid lawsuits, over minors for this. That is a double-edged sword in the sense that I do not want to give up my detailed and private information to a data mining company that would potentially use it, even though they claim they wouldn't because they've been caught in so many lies over the years. And so from a privacy standpoint, I'm not a big fan of that, but I think that's what's going to happen as a result of this verdict. The third thing I was thinking about is that it makes warning labels and safety disclosures vastly more likely. We're probably going to start to get prompts for these things, especially if you've identified yourself as somebody under the age of 18 years old, which is usually the universal standard for that. The fourth thing I thought about was that it raises the odds of more robust parental controls and youth defaults. I think that's a good thing. I think if you're a parent, you're absolutely high to let your kids have social media. The job is to parent. The job is to say no. Studies have shown longitudinally that 18 to 19-year-olds is probably the time you should start on social media if you're going to go down that road. We're all starting to universally agree at 16, and I, like Jonathan Haidt, think that's a start, but the studies really bear out that like about 19 years old is the way to go. The fifth thing I was thinking about is that this increases the value of internal safety documentation. This is something that I know Facebook was lacking because they were cutting their trust and safety teams. But the reason why that's true is because those types of documents are now becoming exhibits in court. If you can't produce safety documentation that's been in place in terms of policies and procedures, that looks negligent, and they're not going to want to have that happen. The problem with policies and procedures, though, is that essentially, what happens for a lot of these organizations, especially if they don't care about these policies and procedures, they're doing it just prima facie wise. In other words, here's what we have. We've been adhering to this, but we really haven't been, et cetera, is that the policies are set it and forget it, and they're not going to actually do anything about them. I mean, I'm a compliance expert. This is one of my parts of my day job, outside of doing, these videos, podcasts, radio shows, all that kind of stuff. And so I think this is inevitable for Facebook to put together. They'll blow the dust off the one they have. They'll probably update it. They'll add some language and all of that and claim this is what they're doing when all of the internal controls show that they're absolutely not. And I that's my opinion, but I believe that is happening. And we have multiple whistleblowers on that. Go watch my video entitled "It's Time to Put Mark Zuckerberg in Jail." I did a 2.0 version last year. It was an hour long of the absolute lies this company has leveled out. And the sixth thing that I could think about of the core 6 is that this actually gives legislators and regulators basically more momentum to demand actual safeguards structurally rather than just voluntary promises that they're never keeping, and they're not. And that's a huge problem. And that said, I don't think Congress, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but I don't think Congress at the federal level is going to make any laws on this anytime soon. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg was just appointed to a tech council by President Trump. So given that President Trump's party right now runs or controls the majorities in the House, the Senate, as well as the Supreme Court, I don't think that's going to happen at the federal level anytime soon because Mark Zuckerberg is a big backer of the president. Another thing is that I think these companies will not say this publicly, but verdicts like this threaten the most sensitive part of their business model. And that is the economics of the engagement systems that they have put together. We have to be on the platforms for as long as possible for them to make maximum dollars. And if a platform like Facebook must reduce compulsive design features for minors, as well as interrupt that endless session of scrolling that we have, and then weaken autoplay features as a result of this verdict, And on top of it, I'm just improving warnings to the rest of us, not to mention age verification, and all those kinds of things. This is going to reduce things like time spent online. And so by virtue of that, that directly impacts their bottom line. I think that's a great thing, even though I think they should be shut down. And if we can't shut them down, we should be able to control them in a way that they just have never been controlled before. And so with all of this said, those were essentially the positives that I see coming out of this. But there is the other side of the coin. And the reason why my segment here is titled the way it is because I don't think this goes far enough. And it's not just about the money, but we'll talk about that. Because this verdict, I think in many ways is a slap on the wrist. And so first things first, as I mentioned, a $6 million reward is BS. That's an absolute BS number relative to the size of these companies. Meta reported almost 201 billion, in revenue in 2025. Alphabet, owner of Google, reported almost 403 billion in the same year as well. So $6 million, that's Mark Zuckerberg rooting around, his couch cushions looking for spare change. It's absolutely insanely low. It's not even funny. No, I will say this. Against that backdrop, this verdict is actually nothing. Let me be direct here, because this is not basically any type of financial blow to big tech. It's not. There's no way. At best, though, it's a warning shot if you look at it that way. And so the symbolism may be considered large, but I think the economic pain that they're experiencing is nothing. So I want to dive into why this is basically a slap on the wrist. And here we go. Now, obviously, the first thing is that Facebook and Google, aka Alphabet, they're appealing the verdict already. So this verdict could be influential from an optics standpoint, but it's not the last word here, because on appeal, things could be potentially reversed. And think about it. Appeals can narrow the legal theory against basically the liability that they have. It can reduce damages. It can limit the practical impact, of the changes that they would be required to make. And until the appellate courts weigh in, these platforms basically have the room to argue that the jury oversimplified because, when we're talking about the causes of adolescent like harm, like mental harm, it could potentially be simplified for the jury. And I think that's what their argument is going to be, if I'm thinking this through. Also, there was no immediate industry-wide injunction, right? I mean, this is a California verdict, and it forces Instagram or YouTube, to potentially do stuff, but it doesn't happen tomorrow. But think about all of the other platforms out there. There's TikTok, Snap, et cetera, et cetera. A jury finding liability is not the same thing as a regulator rewriting a product or a platform, to meet better safety guidelines for the youth or whomever. And on top of this, Meta and Google are loaded. They can spend years in litigation dragging this out for as long as they want to basically not make changes because, the jury's still out, the appellate's still out, et cetera, et cetera. We're just going to keep on going all the way up to the Supreme Court, which again is friendly to their position. So they have the scale, they have the legal resources, they have investor resilience, basically to treat this as essentially a risk management issue. And risk management is also part of my day job, like compliance. And the ability of a Meta or a Google to mitigate this is rather profound. I think that's an important note to think about. And on top of it, some of the biggest structural protections for these platforms still exist, right? Section 230 has not been repealed, and I've written articles in defense of Section 230, but I think they are circumventing it, because if you look at like the old school AOL and the chat rooms and all of that, there was no editorial content, there was no blocking of things. AOL would basically let you do what you want to do, but you have things like filters on essentially the Facebooks of the world, where if you're putting something out there extreme, and I hope nobody would, they will censor you. They've also done things like shadow bans, which is editorial content. If they think they don't want to ban me, then I can basically put stuff out to the world that nobody will see. And I think that, hey, maybe my interactions with followers are lower than they should be, something along those lines. So they're breaking Section 230, or the spirit of it anyway, in those ways. But Section 230 is still there, and it's giving them shelter. The First Amendment is still in part, of the broader legal terrain here. And I think they actually get shelter by virtue of that. And Congress has not enacted a comprehensive national child safety framework in any way, shape, or form. So there's nothing that's imposing uniformed regulations across the entire industry. The two other major defendants here, basically TikTok and Snap, which were originally part of this lawsuit, they settled before the trial. So that limited the amount of public courtroom precedent basically produced against the entire field of social media platforms. We're talking about 2 social media platforms, any one of which I could then switch and move to TikTok if I wanted to. I won't, but I could, not to mention X, aka Twitter, and on and on and on. So the settlement here, it basically may have been rational, I think, but it also means that we don't have basically a single sweeping judgment industry-wide. And I think that is a huge problem. In other words, if I'm going to spin up a social media platform tomorrow, there's no real guidance for me on that short of, let's say, fending off lawsuits, right? Or just the ethics of me putting up a social media platform that has ethics, something Mark Zuckerberg does not have, in my opinion, at all. So all of this said, despite the lack of teeth, I think dismissing this verdict is a mistake here, right? In a major corporate liability cycle, the first major wins often look small before they become large. And I went looking for this to basically prove this hypothesis. And so if you think about it, Big Tobacco is still around. They had a massive verdict against them back in the 80s and all of that. They're still going. You can still buy cigarettes. I mean, it's been reduced. There's been awareness campaigns. The statistical population that is actually smoking cigarettes is much lower than it was even 10, 20, 30 years ago, but nevertheless, they're still there. Opioid litigation against Purdue Pharma and others has not reshaped the industry because of basically the headlines, right? They're still around. The historical pattern is that basically a seemingly modest result like this starts to establish a narrative. So it validates the theory, it draws in more plaintiffs, possible class actions, and eventually shifts both settlement economics and public policy. One of the benefits, I think, of this is that there were thousands of cases pending against Meta, Google, etc., waiting for this verdict to see how the legal landscape would shift. And quite frankly, that is, I think, a positive one. That's, I think, one of the real threats that we have basically against Meta and Google, right? And so I was thinking about this through, and how would a Google or a Meta respond to a situation like this? And so as I was putting together my notes, the first thing I thought of is that I would expect them to increase publicly things like their child safety messaging, improve parental tools. They'll emphasize existing safeguards that they claim they have, and then they'll publicly frame the issue basically as teens are complex. This is a well-being issue, instead of actually saying what the root cause is, which is the platform. And I think that's their take. I think that's their optics and their marketing and their positioning. And at the same time, I think also behind the scenes, I would expect way more legal review for both of these companies on their youth-facing features, more documentation around safety decisions, like I talked about before, that just shows up in court now, and more caution about internal communications that could later be read out loud in court as well. If you recall, in this trial, they were reading internal documentation. We've seen internal documentation coming from whistleblowers as well. They're going to be a lot more on guard specifically for this. And again, we've got thousands of pending trials, civil trials against them for this. And so I hope that what we're going to see is more of a segmentation, essentially by age or age group, right? The safest business response for Meta and Google is not to just radically redesign the whole thing for adult products. I think it's safer for them to create more visible protections for minors, basically separate defaults for teen accounts. Remember, Instagram is now doing Instagram Teen. And my God, if you're a parent and you let your kids use Instagram, even if it's Instagram Teen, please, for the love of God, go read all of the studies and the absolute damage mentally that platform has done. But I think we're going to see those things: separate defaults for teen accounts, basically better parental oversight or controls given to us. I think those are easier to defend in court. You can sell them politically. It's good optics for them and all of that, and it doesn't really change the core content. And for the record, there are plenty of mental health issues in adults, from young adults to the boomers and on, because of Facebook, addiction, anger, all of these kinds of things that Facebook has fostered as well. So I think we're going to also see more scrutiny of the recommendation engines that these platforms have as well. Because once the plaintiffs successfully argue that the harm actually lies in the design and the amplification, that essentially the logic of these platforms has, the recommendation system then becomes central evidence, right? So it's not a minor consideration that a Meta or a Google would have here. And I think that's an important distinction to make as well. And I think that's why algorithm transparency and recommendation control, I think, are going to become issues. They're going to become legal issues, political demands possibly as a result of this, to really understand how Facebook is pumping more and more content to us as we're scrolling. Same with YouTube as well and everything else, right? And so in terms of politics, I expect zero movement at the federal level. Like I said, the government is pretty uniformly basically run by the political party that favors Mark Zuckerberg. He showed up at the inauguration of President Trump 2.0 and all of that. And again, I'm not getting political, but I think we're not going to see anything at the federal level. And I like to jokingly say that Congress right now couldn't get together and vote on what to have for lunch, let alone something as sweeping as legislation for mental health in the youth on social media platforms. But here's the thing. I think at the state level, the attorneys general by state is essentially where this is going to happen. Remember, more than 40 states' attorneys have already sued Meta over youth mental health allegations, and cases like this are going to give lawmakers at the state level a stronger argument that basically says that voluntary self-regulation is clearly failed. And it has. Mark Zuckerberg has literally showed up in front of Congress and lied. And I think that is something that we have to take into account. And the problem that we have is that, okay, let's say we have 40 states out of 50, 30 out of 50, whatever that state count is, California being a perfect example of this, Illinois being another example of this, is that what ends up happening is it becomes more difficult for the Facebooks of the world to comply because depending on where I am, I have more rights than, let's say, a citizen, or more rights to privacy and all of that compared to a citizen, let's say, in a neighboring state. So if I'm in California, and I have all of these controls that the California legislature, has put together. But if I drive across the border into Nevada, and maybe Nevada doesn't have any of that, and so what? Those users then basically get a more wider set than in California, or does the metas of the world have to basically go to the lowest common denominator for protection? And again, my whole thought is I just want them shut down anyway. But I think that is essentially where this is going. So in the end, if I'm really thinking about this verdict is historically important. I think it is. I really do. And I think it's strategically dangerous for Meta, for Google, Alphabet, and all of the others. But it's financially survivable. It's in appeal. So I don't necessarily know if this is really fully, truly going to go anywhere. And I think if I'm looking at it from an overarching 30,000 foot view, I think this is a crack in the dam at best. And so here's hoping the flood is coming soon. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, 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 let them stay private, informed, and secure. Take care.